tell you about that Sakyong was here for. And so we've gotten acquainted in between since that time, and now we're co-facilitating the People of Color Circle as well, and we are co-leading the People of Color Retreat, which is on Saturday, the last Saturday of this month. So I'm very happy that you're here to talk.
Thank you for having
to
me.
us.
Hi, everyone. How are you all doing this morning on this snowy Sunday? We keep getting this weather, of like really warm, and all of a sudden a day like this, and it's going back to really warm. And I can't keep up. I am here to talk to you today a little bit about social action and that intersection of social action and Buddhism particularly. And my background really comes from working at the Shambhala Meditation Center, first here in Chicago for about 7 years, and then becoming the director of social engagement for all of the Shambhala centers, so about 200 Shambhala centers globally. And I held that role for about 2.5 years or so before Shambhala completely collapsed in a quite big way. So I don't know if you all know about that or not. Okay. So yeah, I like to just kind of say that because I think it's important, especially if I'm going to be talking to you about social action, particularly. Because it came out last year that our teacher, Sakyong Mipham Rinpoche, committed sexual assault 10 years ago. And there were even some more recent events of that. So you'll see it if you Google it. There are lots of articles and all kinds of things about it right now. And it's full of controversy. I've got my own feelings about it and thoughts about that. But it seems important to put that out there, especially since I'm going to be talking to you about these movements. So it feels important then, if you all don't know very much about that, to talk a little bit first about kind of my trajectory just a little bit. So I did create a video for the newsletter, so I don't know if any of you have seen that video. You saw it, okay, so you know a little bit about it. But if the majority of you have not seen that, a little bit about my trajectory is that I started working at the Shambhala Center in Chicago after working in the IT and finance world for a good 10 years. And kind of when the IT, the finance industry kind of crashed in 2008, 2009, is kind of when I made the jump to leave. And that's because they were laying off people in the small company that I was working for. They did not lay me off, but they wanted me to work 3 jobs. Yeah. And I wasn't really happy about that. So, and I was never really like, this is my passion, this is what I should be doing with my life. It was always very good financially to me. It was always very, I liked things about it. So that's how I survived in it for so long. And I learned a lot. Which I continue to take with me, but wasn't my passion. And so they gave me this option of taking 3 months severance or taking this job of 3 people. And I said, I'll take the 3 months severance. And that was very controversial with my family because they were like, there's no jobs in the finance industry right now. Are you crazy? Take the money and then try to look for another job. So it was security over anything, and I was just like, I can't do it. This is my chance. I looked at it as an opportunity. It was one of the scariest moments of my life, to be honest, taking this chance, but I did it. I went away on a 1-month silent meditation retreat. I was already part of Shambhala at the time for about 2 years, just as a volunteer and as a practitioner, and I went to this retreat, and I came back, and I was like, I cannot go back. I just can't go back. And so what I was like, I remember just being like in this space of like, what do I do now? And had a little bit of money saved up, so I was living off of that for like 6 months. And the Shambhala Center at the time was hiring for a director. And it was completely volunteer at the time, and it was the first paid director ever, and I said, go for it. And I tried to get it, I didn't get it. And then I knew that that person was going to be able to hire an admin, a part-time admin role. And so I went to that director that they did hire, a guy from Minneapolis named Tom Aducci. And I said, Tom, I would like to be your admin. And he was like, really? And I said, yeah. I said I could be a lot more than an admin to you, it's true, but and I would be. But yeah, I'd like to be your admin. You would have to up the pay a little bit, find a way up the pay a little, because this is really sad. And you'd have to give me at least 25 hours a week. And he made that happen, and I wound up with this job and doing a bunch of consulting work part-time and kind of going like that, taking in a roommate, making a lot of lifestyle changes here and there, and then going on. So I did that for 2 years. Then after 2 years, my teacher, Sakeng Mipam, came and said, you know, we're a very insular community. We're not working with our communities outward at all. We need to use the terminology, turn the flower outward. And so we started thinking about what does that mean, and he said, you need to figure that out in a year, because I'm going to come and I expect to talk to a group of people in the community. And so we got together, and we had these questions, and two of the questions were, what would peace mean to you? What does peace mean to you? And then the second one was, in 10 years, if you wanted to get to that place of peace, what would it take? And of course, there's no real answers to those questions, but it kind of makes you start really thinking in that direction of like, what does that really mean to me? What do I want? What do I want to see? What do I want to feel when I go outside and be in the community? And so the big topic, and it continues to be, of course, but violence in Chicago, right? Gun violence in Chicago particularly kept coming up in the paper. It was very hot in the paper at that time. And we were like, well, that's not peaceful. And we were also like, what do we know about that? We're a mostly white community. Most of us are not from the neighborhoods that this is even happening in. And what right do we really have to even be talking about this? And so what happened was, we hired a consultant. We actually went through many consultants. We hired one, and she said to us, I have a lot of connections with organizations that work with young people and violence, gun violence. I think that they would be interested in a Buddhist organization that wants to, just curious about that. Like no Buddhist organization has come into play, and you guys have this reputation of being peaceful. You're like, all right. So we went, she organized about 25 different nonprofits, all working in this area. We met with them. We told them we do not know anything about this. We're totally honest. It's one of the things we actually did right. We did a lot of wrong things, which I will also share. But this is something we did really, really right, and it was just being totally honest about where we were and saying, we don't know anything about this. And I think that was what made them want to work with us. And they did. And so they said, well, if you can't do this unless you meet young people who are actually part of this. So we don't know any. And they're like, don't worry, we got that. So they organized a group of young people, a lot of them from Alternative Schools. Alternative Schools Network is an organization that has a lot of different alternative schools underneath them and that they work with. And alternative schools, these particular alternative schools had young people from the ages of 16 mostly to 21, mostly who had dropped out of school and come back, who had been part of gangs, had family members that had been part of gangs, had seen people been shot, had been shot themselves, a number of different things. And we met with them and we asked them these same questions that were asked to us. What does peace mean to you? And what would peace look like in your community? And most of them could not answer and were kind of surprised to be asked. And this thing that was supposed to be an hour and a half, 2 hours, just wound up being 3 hours long because they had so much to share and they shared so much with us. It's still to this day really like that is sort of the crux or the moment of when things changed for me. Is just hearing these stories, story after story after story of these young people's lives. And so we created this conference with these young people. We asked them to be part of the conference. They co-facilitated small groups with us, and we created this giant conference with about 400 people. Partly our Sangha, people from all over the place came in. And you were there. So
the one that you
actually, that was the second. Yeah, the chapel. That was the original one. Yeah. So kind of after that, some of the young people came back to us and said, we don't have safe spaces in our city to be doing this work. Like, we've never even asked this question before of what does peace mean to me? We need more of that. And the nonprofit said, more meditation, please. We were stressed out, we were overwhelmed. And so we responded and said, okay. So around that time, I was getting ready to leave. I was still the admin, and I was done being an admin, quite honestly. And I was done working part-time. And so I said I was leaving. And around that time, we moved from the Rogers Park Center to the center that they are currently in now, which is the West Loop Center. And in the West Loop Center, my plan was to help them move and then leave. And so my director came to me and said, how can I get you to stay? And I said, well, I have to work full time. He said, I can make that happen. I said, okay, I don't want to be the admin anymore. What do you want to do? I said, I don't know. I haven't thought about it. So I started kind of trying to figure out what I would want to do. And then he said, I have an idea. I said, what? He says, well, we have a bunch of volunteers. We do not know how to do this. We do not know what we're doing. We know how to do our programming of the center. We don't know how to do this, whatever this is. We need someone to figure that out, and I think it needs to be a paid position. I said, wow, that's interesting. And so I became the first director of social engagement, a title you completely made up, and my job was to figure it out. And that was it. That was my job description, was figure out what to do next. So over the next 3 years, I spent time really getting into the community. The young people we were working with came into our center, started an open mic night, started an art gallery. We had an art gallery showing with them. We had an open mic night that went on for 2 years called Speak Up Chicago, where 60, 70 young people from all over the city would come and perform in our center. Matt, my husband, was really very part of that, because what ends up happening is you have a lot of young people, and they become very close to you, and then you become their mentor. And so we had a group of people kind of in their 30s and 40s that became mentors to these young people, and the whole thing kind of took a life of its own. And I got very, very involved with a lot of the nonprofits, and I got invited to come into the work that they were doing and provide meditation in different spaces, and it became part of conferences. It just kind of took off on its own. It had really, I didn't have control over it almost. It had control over me. I was being kind. So then, this was the very sad part of the story. So this went on for 2.5, 3 years. And in the end, my Sangha decided that they needed to end it. And this is something that I've learned, and this is part of the mistakes I really made. When you have people of color, particularly, coming into the center, which is what was happening, a lot of people of color coming into our center from neighborhoods that people did not frequent. And you have young people who are different, that you don't have experience of, start to come into the center, and they start to consider your center their center too. Ugliness will come out. Lots of ugliness will come out because we have biases, because they are there and they are very real. And people may not even be aware of the biases they hold. But when stuff starts to actually happen, ugly comes out. And that is what happened at the Chicago Shambhala Center. Ugly came out. And so what happened was, when the Chicago Shambhala Center, which was in a financial crunch, in all honesty, saw that as an opportunity to say, we can get rid of the salary, and we can get rid of your salary. And that was very much what happened with my position. So then when that happened, the bigger Shambhala, who had now been part of 4 events that I helped curate with others, then said, no, you're not allowed, no. And then created a position for me in larger Shambhala because they wanted to do what we were doing everywhere. They wanted to see that happen everywhere. And so that became my role. And when I took that role on, my focus really shifted because of what I had learned. And we really started with doing training with gender, training with race, training with class, training with every ism you could think of, right, that we had, our biases. We really started to work with that on that level because I already knew that if we started to just go out, and we didn't go in this way, then what would happen at the Chicago Shambhala Center would happen everywhere. And so that is kind of the track we went on. So that's a little bit of my journey. And then of course last year, my journey there came to an end again because my teacher came out. My teacher had committed sexual assault. And in some cases very recently. And so that was a real shock, even to me. It's a real shock. I did not know anything about it. And so, that continues to be the state that the Shambhala centers are in right now, of people trying to grapple with that and better understand what this means when your teacher does something, right? Because for me, my teacher has meant the world to me in so many ways. In so many ways, he really taught me about basic goodness, and the goodness within the worth that I have in myself comes because he showed that to me. He was able to mirror that for me, and at the same time, he did these horrible things. And so I've had to figure out what that means for me, and to realize that actually we hold both of those things all the time, right? We have good and bad sort of in us all the time, and so both of those are possibilities of how we manifest. And so it isn't about like villainizing him and saying he's bad, or saying that he's good because which a lot of people are polarizing it, right? People are like, he's still good, he's come back, and other people are like, he's a jerk and animal, can't come back, It's this there's a lot of polarization. And the answer, I think, is both, and that's a hard truth for us to hold, very hard. So, I'll stop talking about that. There's a lot more I could say about that, and I'm happy to answer any questions about that if you have them later. So what I want to kind of transition to, and if you have questions, we'll take those and we'll start talking about that. Does anybody have questions at this point, until I can transition to something else a little bit? Yeah.
So is the Shambhala Center in the Westlake still functioning?
It is still functioning.
They still have their full curriculum and everything?
They have,
Taking classes there?
I think that they have kind of tailored the curriculum back a bit. So they still offer some of their like introductory curriculum, but I have not seen much advanced kind of stuff going on there.
And is that particular membership just, I think they're gonna keep the building and?
They own the building, or not own the building, they own the space that they're in.
They're just gonna keep on Congo?
Yeah, they're keeping on. I know very little about it because I'll be honest, it is a very sore space for me and difficult space for me to be in. There was never any healing and reconciliation for me after what happened. And so it's a very odd place for me and very difficult for me to be in that space. So I'm not part of like the, what are they doing now? And I do feel like it's probably a little stuck still. And I don't know how the community is grappling with that, because I feel very much like I'm severed from the community almost. Not the wider community so much. I have lots of people that I know in the wider community, but in this particular, in my own city, I'm kind of severed from it, to be honest. So I couldn't give you the details of it. Yeah.
I was interested in your description of some of the negativity that occurred when young people came in, and surprised that there wasn't work to try to, work is the double word here, work on that work. Could you speak about that a moment?
Yeah. Part of it is that somebody has to spearhead that work. That's a lot of work. In hindsight, if I had to go back and redo all of this, that work would have been happening simultaneously to what I was doing, and I would have made sure that that happened. But it was new territory for me. I didn't know what I was doing, and to be honest, I didn't know what I was doing the whole time I was there. I was making it up as I went along, and there was no blueprint for me to follow really. And things just started happening. And I was getting more energy, quite honestly, in the things I was involved in, going out and being in these spaces with these amazing people and who wanted me there. And really, it was like this amazing match of Dharma and the social action work happening. And that was a really exciting place for me to be. So I spent a lot of my time out, which is a lot of work. And so there wasn't anybody doing the internal work that really needed in the Sangha. Needed to happen, and we didn't have anybody that was really versed in how to do that. We did have one person who had done some diversity work, but not on the level it really needed to be done at. And so if I were to go back, I would do things very, very differently. But I think there was a recognition that that had to happen, but it happened almost too late. It was like by that point you had people that just really wanted me out of there, and that was very difficult to work with. Very difficult.
I appreciate your honesty about that.
Yeah. I think, I share this story not because I'm trying to villainize my Sangha, but because it's a learning experience, I think. Like, if we can learn from the things that happened at the Chicago Cheval Center, then we won't repeat those same things. So I think it's an important story, is to share, like, the amazing things that happened there, but also the really painful things that happened.
Well, one of the comments that filtered down to us is, why do we have all these kids coming in? They're not going to be Buddhists. So I felt like there was no point in having them in this space.
Yeah.
But I think it's an important story, and as you continue, I'd also like your insights on, to me, when you said the ugly came out, that's also what's happened, in the United States in the past 3 years.
Yeah, there is no difference than what happened in the Chicago Cheval Center. That's not what's happening anywhere else. Like, all of the things that have happened in my Sangha have happened, they're completely microcosm of the outer. So yeah, thank you. Yeah, absolutely. Which is what I'm going to kind of shift over to.
And by the way, Trump flashed a white supremacy sign in his talk last night. Yes. Just FYI.
That's great.
Not really shocking.
Yeah.
I should say there's several books actually that this sort of the Dharma in the West and bringing in people of color. There's a gentleman, and there's in East Bay, San Francisco. There's that center. They also have their own issues with having a people of color based Sangha. So there's a lot of written on this topic too, that is not just, for Shambhala, it's kind of Dharma in the West and making it more inclusive, right?
Absolutely.
There's the gentleman, I'm going to say,
Larry Yang.
Larry Yang, yes. I was thinking Yang, I'm thinking, that's the presidential candidate. No, yes, there are other Yangs, right?
Yes.
So Larry Yang, he's written a good book about this,
Yeah.
and in training I'm doing, we're talking about these issues, so
Yeah.
it's a wider.
Much wider, yeah. It's Sangha wide. It's Sanghas everywhere in the whole. I would say beyond the United States too, because I did get to work a little bit globally. Although those issues are a little bit different, they're not. They're actually, some of them are even tougher to work with. And some people in Europe have said, well, at least you're talking about this stuff. We're not even talking about it here. So there's that.
So is what you're going to talk about parallels between what progressive organizations are also doing, parallel to this, their own self-analysis, their own looking. I can speak as a feminist, that I know that certainly it's a long time coming and very slow and painful, as you say, but I do believe there's a real intent within, that's a community they can really speak of. And so these are kind of parallel things that we don't have to like reinvent the wheel, in other words.
No.
There are groups, and you can also, like I noticed that the library was having a diversity circle. So is there a reason that we have to do this alone? I'm not sure we have to do it alone.
I don't believe that we have to do it alone. There's lots of like work being done out there that I would recommend and like that we could connect to. It's not as though like we're in some sort of like microcosm, but then there's of course there's the work being done just Sangha wide, right, in the Buddhist circles, and like you were talking about, right? And there's that to connect to. And then I do think it's important that your community also talks about it as your individual community. So I think it's all of those things, right? It's, you don't want to turn into like it being a bubble, like where you have no idea what's going on the outside. So it's important to know what's going on and connect with those things too. But equally, it's important to then do the work inside your own community, I think, too. It's both. You know, it's a lot. So I want to shift a little bit. It's not really shifting, but I want to talk about a little bit about just kind of diving into why does this happen, right? Why does this happen? And I titled this first part in mind when I typed this up. I was thinking, are middle class white Buddhist sanghas, right? That's what they are, you know. That's what they are, unless they're Asian-based sangha, right? That's different, right? That's there too. But a lot of our Western sanghas are mostly white, mostly middle class. You know, kind of fall into the sort of category. Not saying everybody is that, but majority. And why is that? You know, why is that? Sometimes now, knowing what I know, I walk into a space and I look at the people around me, and it kind of tells me a story. It tells me a story. And you know, a lot of what I heard at the Chicago Shambhala Center and in other sanghas is, I don't understand why we're doing this. I don't see any difference between people. And people are all basically good, and we all have Buddha in nature, and right? Okay, so that's a very problematic thing. But like, yes, though, we do all have Buddha nature, and we do all have basic goodness, and that is the big view. That's what we really want to be at, right? That would be great. And in this particular time period, in this world, we also know that's not the way it is, right? That we know that we haven't created a world right now that reflects that, unfortunately. Sadly, we haven't. And so we just end up with this world where we have the dominant groups, right? We have, if you're white, if you're male, if you're cisgender, right? If you're able-bodied, you know, there's lots of them. I'm sure you could name some too. But if you're all of those things, you hold a certain amount of privilege, right? And we all hold a certain amount of privilege. So privilege is not a category. It's not like it's a category of like you're either one and you're not privileged, or you're privileged. We all probably fall on a spectrum somewhere. Many of us probably fall on a spectrum somewhere. What I mean by that is I am a cisgender woman who is married to a white man. It gives me privilege. I am I fall into the middle class. That gives me privilege. Right? So I hold privilege. I'm also a person of color, and I'm a woman, and in those places I maybe don't hold as much privilege. So that's what I mean by that. If I go to India, where my family's from, I hold a lot of privilege. Caste-wise, right? So it changes even. You know, you go to a different country and it could change. And so it's not like a fixed thing, right? I want us to think like beyond that. We hear that word, it's becoming a real buzzword, and when these buzzwords happen, we kind of don't use the meaning or something a lot of times. So this idea of privilege, you know. And then you have people who fall into categories where they really don't have much privilege. If you're black, if you're trans, if you are low income, right? You're falling into categories of privilege you don't have much privilege. And so you are constantly then getting a message. I'm not basically good. Right? I am not basically good. The world is telling me I'm not basically good. You might be able to relate to that just based on your own level of privilege. Like if you are a woman, for example, and if you are a woman and you've ever had gender things happen in a workplace or a situation, right? You get this message that somehow you're less than. So if you're constantly getting that message, you're less than, because you're not privileged in so many categories, then how are you going to feel? A lot of us will internalize that over time. And then where is the basic goodness? Even if you look at that person as basically good, they don't feel basically good. You're not giving them the message. The world is not giving them the message that they're basically good. So how do you, what's there to believe in? So there's that. Then there is the people who are more privileged, hold more privilege. And many of us would like to be comfortable. We are comfortable. We're comfortable and we would like to stay comfortable. Right? I'm guilty of that. So I want to relate this now to this neighborhood particularly, because I think that's important. So Austin, the Austin neighborhood. So I found this. Barbed wire, Berlin Wall, and color line are ways some residents of Chicago's West Side neighborhood, Austin, describe Austin Boulevard, the street that separates them from suburban Oak Park. One thing Oak Park did was turn most of the streets crossing Austin Boulevard into cul-de-sacs to make it less convenient for new residents of Austin to get into Oak Park. The differences in income, education, and crime are massive, and in between the percentages lay Austin Boulevard and years of racial tension and change. The suburb of Oak Park is 67% white, while the majority of Austin neighborhood is African American. In 1930, 0.1% of Austin residents were black. By 2000, that number was 90%. So I thought this was interesting to talk about because that line is right there. Right there.
Right there.
Right there.
And walk to it.
Right. The barbed wire line is right there. And so I find that really interesting, particularly that it's so close. And yet, you know, going back to this idea of safety, it's like we create these barbed wires and these cul-de-sacs, if you will, to stay safe from the bad people. You know, and that's the message, right? We're just trying to stay safe. What does that mean to stay safe? Well, so here's another really couple of interesting things, and I hear this all the time. I heard it the other day at the chiropractor. My chiropractor said, "Oh, you're going to Garfield Park Conservatory. Be careful, that's a bad neighborhood." Bad neighborhood, right? What does that mean? Bad neighborhood. Usually when we're talking about it, we're talking about we are afraid or we fear that there might be violence in that neighborhood, and we fear for our own safety when we go into those neighborhoods. That's usually what that means. But I found this particularly interesting. So in our study of serious violence in 20 years, we found that less than 1% of a city's population, the share involved in what we call street groups, which are gangs, sets, and crews, is generally connected to over 50% of the city's shootings and homicides. The number of people committing the homicides and shootings is less than 1% of the city's population in these groups. And so when you're talking about the number of people that are actually committing the homicides, there's a very small percentage. And so who's actually living in the neighborhood behind the barbed wire, right? Is it the 1% of the shooters? Yes, maybe. And what about the other 99? What about the rest of the people, right? And so we are putting an invisible fence or a line at people who actually really need our help, right? Because we're going hungry. And I speak from experience of knowing people there. They are going hungry, and their housing is not adequate, and they're living in poverty and in dire circumstances. And so you have this situation where we have put up this fence to keep them out. And so they don't have access, right? And so you very much have this situation. And most of those people don't want to live in violence either. Right? Just as we don't want to live in violence and we are afraid of going into the bad neighborhood, the majority of the people that live over there in that bad neighborhood don't want to live there either. They don't want their neighborhood to be violent. Nobody wants to live in violence. But if we keep shutting our doors, if we just keep putting up the fences, it's a recipe for disaster, right? And then what about our Buddhist values? Where did they go? What are we trying to do? So, like this quote, this is from philosopher activist Cornel West. It says, justice is what love looks like in public. So, if we're going to really love, what does that really mean? What does that look like for us? And being here, just located where you are, what does it mean to take down the Berlin Wall that's in our backyard? So, I kind of leave you with that. It's a contemplation. I don't have the answers, but what does that mean? Who are the people? The invisible faces that we don't see every day, and how do we know them? How do we get to know them? How do we touch their humanity and work to make our city safer? Not just safer, but work to help people in our city who really need it. I see so many people wanting to do work overseas and whatnot. And I always find that interesting, because I'm like, we live in a city that all of those things are happening right here under our nose. But we're so afraid. We're so afraid of it. Because we're afraid of what might happen to us and our safety. So, that's a lot. Yeah.
Can I jump in?
Please.
Well, and also when talking about bad neighborhoods, so at least with Speak Up Chicago, with the youth open mic program, a lot of the youth were from Humboldt Park, and got to know a group of young people who lived in Humboldt Park. And I remember talking to little Chris, and he said, well, we used to live 3 blocks over there, then over here, and then over here, and now we live here. And talking to a lot of the young people, that we seem to think, okay, if it's a bad neighborhood, if there's violence there, then it's some sort of like wasteland. But a lot of what I discovered was a lot of tension and a lot of stress was there, but also a lot of community ties, and a lot more than like my ties to the people on my block or most of the neighborhoods that I've lived in. A lot of people have lived there for a long time, and the relationships, because of the stress of the violence, can really disrupt relationships, but they really knew each other. There was a lot stronger ties. They grew up with each other. There was a lot of strong community and family ties in these neighborhoods that I've learned from and still need to work on instituting in my own neighborhoods. So I think that I just thought that was important to point out.
Yeah, I think it's very important to say, I think, thank you, that it's not us going to help them all the time, of like, we're helping the little people or something. It's not about that. It's actually mutual. I cannot tell you how much it has changed my life, how much all of the people that I've gotten the privilege to work with and to be with have changed me. And one of my mentees, Antoinette, who really just comes from a background of, where there's a lot of poverty, and she's the most generous person I think I might have ever met. She is always looking for ways to be generous, having almost nothing, and she's trying to find a way to help. Well, that guy on the street is worse than me, at least I have a roof over my head, let me give him something, right? I mean, I've learned so much generosity from people who don't have much.
Willie.
Yeah.
My friend Willie, who sells Streetwise, he's at the Starbucks on Lake Street on Monday. Okay, so he used to go to my Sangha, Panasambhava Buddhist Center, and he's making like $60 a week or something, and he's still giving away from that set of money. Like, it was mind blowing when he tried to give me money for our rent, and it was just I couldn't believe it. So there's a lot of generosity. Can be a lot of generosity.
A lot of generosity. Yeah.
And I think that's I think that's a more powerful word than how can we help?
Yes.
Because I think there is a paternalistic kind of way when we say, even if it's not conscious, but I do believe in our hearts there is this intent to be of good. But we use language that sometimes prevents us from really understanding. And I think the word generosity it's not charity. It's really about from this heart of give and take.
Yeah.
And learning that way, than to say, how can we help?
Yes.
And I think there is sometimes just being in a place, like the fact that the center has chosen to be here is a very powerful statement. Yet we want to also not just sit in that statement. We want to, how do we do it? But we have to figure out language and actions that incorporate this generosity as opposed to this kind of paternal approach.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And somebody was mentioning earlier not to reinvent the wheel. There is a lot of effort there's one called Bridge, which is a more appropriate kind of way of relating, to bridge both. And it's mainly from the churches in both Oak Park and from Austin, who are meeting together, doing different kinds of activities and education. There's a West Side men's group, there's a West Side women's group, which is both
That's amazing.
communities meeting together
Yeah.
over meal and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And there's an organization called Bridge, and it's anyone invited, and they organize and do things. They did a health fair, which was for West Side men and others Loretta helped with it, and they helped them with their health concerns and so forth. So
Yeah.
things are going on.
Yeah, I'm sure that there are.
All I'm
Yeah.
saying is,
Yeah.
rather than be a solo, what are we gonna do,
Yeah.
there's already
Yeah.
things to join, actually.
Yes. And that's exactly where to start, right? Like you're not trying to reinvent everything, and you first, I think we're seeing even in Shambhala, who's already doing it? Who can we work with? Who's already doing the work? How do we make friends with those people? How can we be part of rather than invent something new? Definitely would encourage you to see what's there already and be part of that, right? That's the outer part,
Right.
Then of course there's the inner part of like, okay, so if I'm sitting here talking to a guy with big baggy pants, do I have a conception about this person already that's going through me, right? And am I embarrassed of that? Right? That's real. I used to be the person that, I would be walking the street and if I saw a big black guy, I might be like, taken aback. That's real. I have to work with that stuff, because we've been conditioned. We've been conditioned in our society to see people in a certain way. People see me in a certain way. So, yeah, we have to uncondition ourselves. So that has to happen too. And I'm sure that there are things that are going on in that regard as well here, hopefully, that you can either plug into or find people. Yeah, it's both. It's hard and a lot comes up. Right? A lot comes up. This is where I think our practice really comes in too. I want to point that out. Is that this is something that we actually have to offer. We actually have to offer that, right? Because people are doing this work. And we have a lot to learn from them, but also, are you going to hold that when that ugly comes up, right? And that's what our practice, this is our practice in action of being able to sit with that and be with that and work with those emotions that come up. And we have tools to do that. Which is so amazing when you think about it. Yeah, and you can share that too. Yeah.
talking about how you, with your teacher, for instance, that there's both the, the ugly and the beautiful, and they're both true. And for me, I think, Zen koans have helped me think about that, because it does go beyond, the kind of Aristotelian logic that we're trained in, that it's both and but the Zen tradition, like the stories are important, and so because I know you do interplay, I was wondering if you could say a little bit maybe about story and the place of story, these kind of explorations.
For me, story has been very powerful in terms of just human stories, right? Those biases seem to melt away, at least for me. Like I might look at a person and have one thought about it. And then I might talk to them and hear a little bit about their story, and my perception of them will be so wrong, or it will change, right? And then I hear another story. And so stories are very, very powerful. Human stories are very powerful, because that's how we get to know people. That's how we get to see their goodness shine through, because we might not see it otherwise. So in that sense, story is very, very powerful. At least that's what I would say. Yeah. How about anybody else? How has story impacted you?
I just saw the movie last night, Just Mercy, and which the story took place in the early 90s in the South, and I thought, man, it's not that long ago, of severe racism, and anyway, it's just, we've made progress, but as you were mentioning, Mr. Trump and so forth, our leaders, it's just, it's embedded in this nation.
Yeah. Yeah.
And sometimes we can't take on the big thing. Yeah. I mean, I think that we can get lost, or we can have a spiritual kind of reckoning when we also go beyond, or if we want to do work and think, well, I'm going to change the world, when the world that's a big thing. I mean, maybe we want to do that for the rest of our life, but what do we do now in our world? I mean, not to ignore, it's all of you, what you're saying is to me a balancing act. You have and you have this, and everything is, where do we put our intention and our hearts and move from there? And not simply or just, but just that's to begin.
Yeah. Yeah. Just begin, exactly. Take some steps. Yeah. Sometimes, see, everything is a balance. Even being on the cushion versus how much you do out in the world is a balance, right? It's like sometimes you can get really crazy and just go out there and do, and like there's no sense of self anymore. You've lost yourself. You have to come back to the cushion and be. Or sometimes we get stuck in the being, and then we're just too afraid to get out there. And so it's like this constant balance for sure. Yeah, it's definitely like, but I will say that everything is about relationship when it comes down to it anyway. Right? I mean, you will not change the world just because you want to. You will change the world by to one relationship at a time. And that's where the stories are powerful, right? That's how we create relationship. Everything that happened to me at the Chicago Shabbat Center when I got that role, all of those roles, was about cultivating relationship. It was the seed of everything. Nothing happened without that. That's how I could make things happen, because of who I say it's all about who you know, but that's because it's a relationship. It's all about human relationship.
That's why I think Mark's comment about working with groups that are already in action is so important, because we are unknown in the Austin community. Who are you coming in? But if we join people who are in process, then we become part of that too. And I think that's very important.
Yeah.
So we become part of the story, if you will.
Yes.
And the balance, the ones who have made such a large impact, Martin Luther King, Gandhi, Thich Nhat Hanh, very centered in a love ethic, not hatred,
Right.
but to see the love in those people and believe in that love, that others can turn around and find that within them who are not at that place, but believing that they can, is more powerful than sort of coming in with a sort of anger or anything else about injustice and all the isms.
That's the big view, but the isms are important. You know, we can't lose those because they're real. Real in the sense that our culture is created by that right now, right? And if we just say like we're just going to focus on the love, that's only half of it. It's only part of it, because if we don't work on the ugly, then it just won't be real somehow. Right?
Yeah, but those three did not ignore the ugly.
No.
Martin Luther King, Thich Nhat Hanh, or Gandhi.
Yeah.
They stood right up to it.
Yeah, and that's why I'm saying it's both. Yeah.
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 I want to just say how grateful I am that you have the courage to come and talk about this. I think it's a difficult subject. Part of the story of this center is that I think it was, when did Ferguson happen? 2014, 15? Ferguson happened, and we felt, I think many in the Sangha felt that there was some moral imperative that we deal with that, but we didn't have a clue about where to begin, so we started a social action circle. And it was hard to sustain a conversation about race. We were always talking about what can we do in Austin, but we didn't have a clue. And I think we have grown a little bit, and we used to think that we were diverse. So look at the room. We're not diverse, we're white. And so mostly what I want to say, and I really want to express my appreciation that you have helped us begin to realize that we really need to do internal work. And so we now have a black circle or black caucus. We're having
A black circle?
people of colors, circle. And we have a white, we were calling it a diversity circle when we met last week and decided to call it white identity circle, because we spent the whole time talking about being white. And you know what? We have a really hard time talking about being white. So we're studying, really, I recommend this book. It's by Dr. Robin DiAngelo, White Fragility. And it's really good for us as white people to really begin to practice with our own discomfort and our vulnerability about even trying to talk about race as white people, because we don't know how to do it. I don't know how to do it. I still don't know how to do it. And it's really uncomfortable. And I think part of our practice here is to be vulnerable and to not know and not be so certain about our opinions about it. We seem to have a lot of opinions about race, but we really don't know much about it as white people. That we're also socialized. And I think there's a tendency in Zen, when we think about non-duality, to just cover over all that, the dark side, all the racism that's part of this culture, that we're all a part of as well. We're all colluding with it, we're a part of it. And it's just a really, I just think it's realistic to acknowledge how difficult it is for us to come to terms with this. And so I encourage you to join if you identify or don't. See, we don't even identify as white people, because we're like a non-identity. It's so weird, isn't it? But if you are a white person and you don't identify as a person of color, so you're not going to go to that circle, come to the white identity circle. We're meeting once a month, and it's a place where we can feel safe as white people and begin to learn about racism, and how we are a part of it. And I think that's where we start. It'd be great to do something in Austin, and maybe I hope we get there. I think we will, but I think one of the things Arthi has made really apparent to me is that we need to do internal work. as well as work out in the community. So where we can start is with our own practice. The other issues are large and overwhelming, and you easily just shut down when you think about race in America. But we can start here. And Arthi, you've helped us begin to have that conversation, and for that I will be forever grateful to you. Thank you.
Eve, you've got your hand.
Yeah, I guess I don't know how much I want to say, but I mean, I feel like that excludes me, frankly. I mean, you were talking about the shifting identities depending on where you are. And I have been in contexts where I've been considered non-white, and I've also been in contexts where I've been considered white. And so now I feel like I belong in either circle.
Yeah, so this is important. So the reason, so in my experience of working with race for a while in Shambhala, this is something I've learned, is that separating into these identity groups is helpful. I'm glad that you've changed it from a diversity circle into, quite frankly, into a white identified circle. And here's why. It's because in groups that I've been part of that are mixed, where everybody's just thrown in the same basket, right? And this can also be true for gender. Where everybody is just sort of thrown in. What tends to happen is I've been diversity groups where then the white folks in that group will be talking, and they will say something which is very genuine to them, but it will anger a person of color, and that's happened to me. And then there's this like group of people of color that are like, you don't get it. And then there's this white person that's like really trying to get it, right? And but this person of color is like, you're offending me right now. You don't even know it, right? So it's like white people need spaces to talk about this stuff. It's real, right? And it's wherever that person was at, that's where they're at. They're trying to learn. So pouncing on them is not going to help them, right? But yet you have the person of color whose feelings are hurt in that situation, and that's real too. So what do you do with that? So in talking in these separate identity groups, it doesn't mean we're going to be in separate identity groups forever and ever and ever, and that's the goal. But it's the space that we can create, a space that's safe enough for us to really talk about those things that are difficult, right? We're creating something, well, okay, I can say something here without having to worry about offending this person of color over here. I'm going to be able to just fully share myself. It's a way of being able to fully share. And people of color need those spaces as well. Because remember that thing I was talking about of deeply internalized oppression? Okay, well, self-hatred, all these things, they don't have places to come out when the majority of the group is white. They just don't. I've been in so many white spaces where I can't be myself completely, So there is something about having a person of color space that's, free, And you could take this even, you could have a black circle. You could have a women's circle. You could have a transgender circle. You could have many circles, right? But it's a way of saying, like, I want to create a circle so that I can be free to speak about how I'm feeling in this safe space for me right now. Right? Yeah.
I think it comes down to sort of identity, right? And so how you self-identify and where you feel a common pain by identifying a certain way in a dominant culture of other. That's the safe space you're creating, right?
Yes.
So the purpose, so it doesn't have, you may feel that today I need to be vulnerable because of I want to be in a women's group because and I don't feel comfortable talking about this, or So I think it can vary how you identify, and those people are coming together because they identify on that level and have shared some pain.
Yes. And so you may want to explore both of those groups, or you may say, these groups don't fit, and there might be other people that are feeling like me, and so I'm going to create XYZ group because this is how I identify. Whatever that is for you.
Yeah, I think that's what he brought up is important because people could be multicultural and they don't feel like they belong in any one identity group, and then it's really confusing because people from one group put them down and the other group, and they don't belong anywhere. So I think there needs to be a space for multicultural identity where it's not clear where you belong and you choose where you want to belong.
It could be, I mean, there's people who are biracial that feel like they want to speak with other people who are biracial. And there are groups that are like, you know what, I'm confused. So you know what, or there could be people that are like, well, I want to work with my whiteness. I have internalized whiteness. But I'm also a person of color. So I'm gonna go to both these groups and see what works for me. You know, it may be that. Maybe you don't know. And maybe you haven't worked with this enough to know. And maybe it changes. Maybe your identity changes through the process.
I think the guideline here for the circle that you want to be in is how do you identify at the time that you want to be in that circle.
Yeah, well, right, but I mean, part of that is talking about that play between, you know, how you might identify and then how other people might identify you. And
Yeah,
like you said, you know, what that does to you. You know, how other people identify you does to your own sense of self.
Yep.
Yep.
There was a
And
10
stories about how that, you know, changes over time.
There was 10 years ago, 15, maybe more like 15 years ago, I would not have identified as a person of color. That bothered me. And I remember we had a person of color scholarship that was there in Shambhala, and I was like, I don't get that. And then here I am, completely identified as a person of color. I just didn't understand that then. And I had to do my own exploration and understanding before I could even come to that point. So sometimes it's just that. It's just where you are, you know.
We are at 11 o'clock, 11:01.
Yeah.
So thank you very much. And I know if people have further questions,
Yeah,
Arthi will be available.
yeah. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you.